All right. Hey, folks. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a minute or two here to let everybody filter in and get settled before we get started today. We do have a lot of content to go through, so we won't give it too long, but feel free to say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. That should be turned on for, yes, turned on for everyone. Let us know if there's snow where you are. If you like, Julian, there's snow. I think I saw like New York actually got like legit snow for the
We
first
did.
time.
First time in 2 years, I think there's snow that's stuck in Central Park. So very happy to see it.
That's awesome. We did not actually get snow in Seattle. It did get very cold. And now it's raining, but it's like 35 and raining, which is just disgusting. But it snowed a lot in Portland, so it seems to have just missed us. Per PNW. All right, for folks just joining, free to say hi in the chat. I'm going to give it one more minute here before we get started. One note of housekeeping, Zoom will very likely default your chat to send messages only to hosts and panelists, which means just Julian and I can see them. It's best if you change that to everyone so that if you have a comment or ask a question, then everyone can see them. Sure. All right, folks. Okay, we're still taking up quite a lot, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here because we do have a lot to get through today. Go ahead and pull up the chat over here and go ahead and kick us off. So folks, thanks so much for joining. This is our second webinar of 2024, and we're really excited. We've already got a great slate of topics listed, including we covered the new 2.8 release last week. So if you missed that, we can throw a link for you in the chat to so you can watch the recording. But lots of great stuff already for 2024 going on in the Airflow community. I always like to start our webinars just with an update of things going on. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into that. Again, we've got a lot of stuff to go through today. For Airflow community events, we like to highlight things that are going on both virtually, so other webinars like this one, as well as in-person meetups. Those are happening all over the world, and there are a couple coming up in February. For virtual events, we have Snowpark Day coming up at the end of this month. That's actually hosted by Snowflake, highlighting Snowpark, and there is going to be a talk as part of that on using Snowpark and Airflow that we collaborated with Snowflake on and are really excited about. So if you use Airflow and Snowflake, highly recommend you check that out. In terms of upcoming community events, there's, or I should say in-person events, there's a Sao Paulo meetup the first week in February. I believe that's the first one in Sao Paulo. I think I saw somebody in the chat saying they were from Brazil. Obviously, Brazil is a big country, so I didn't catch whether they were close to Sao Paulo or not. But if you were in that area, highly recommend that. Cool, at least one person is. Well, we hope you go to the meetup. That should be a good time. There's also going to be one in Bangalore in February at the Cloudera headquarters. So if you are in that neck of the woods, you can check that out. For Content Spotlight today, we've got a couple of connections related content. We will provide the links to these resources in the recap, so they will be very relevant to the content that we're going through today. And as always, we highly recommend that you join the Airflow Slack if you are not already. That's a great way to get in touch with the Airflow community, as well as us. We are in the Airflow Slack, and that's a good way to reach us if you ever need anything. Next bit of community stuff, the Airflow Summit is happening this year, or I should say it's scheduled for this year. It also happened in 2023, which was really great to see folks in person. This is happening in September, the 10th through 12th in San Francisco in 2024. Highly recommend you get that on your calendar, especially if you are traveling internationally or interested in going. Now is a great time to kickstart the process for getting visas and all of that stuff. So we'll throw a link to the Airflow Summit website in the chat. You can sign up there for updates. So we will be releasing more information about the venue and tickets and the CFP and all of that stuff in the coming months. So we would love to see you all there in person in September this year. So definitely check that out. Finally, I'm very excited to announce that yesterday, or I should say earlier this week, I've already lost track. It's Thursday. We launched the Airflow Champions program for or I should say Astronomer Champions program for Apache Airflow. So this program is designed to celebrate folks in the Airflow community who are contributing to the project, maybe outside of actually contributing code to Airflow. So that could be things like you're writing lots of content, you're helping answer questions in the Airflow Slack, things like that. So folks who are passionate, who are using Airflow a lot and helping to drive the project forward and support the community. If you are interested, if you think that this describes you and you're interested in learning more and potentially being part of a future cohort, definitely check out the website and reach out to us if you have any questions. There's an application form that you can fill out there. So highly, highly encourage everybody to apply. We're very excited about this and there's lots of benefits for people who are part of the program, and we want to give some airtime and give back to those people who are doing a lot for Airflow. Okay, so that was all of my community stuff. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and jump into our content today, because again, we've got a big topic today and there's a lot to cover with it. A couple of notes of housekeeping before I dive in. This is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording afterwards, along with the code that I'm going to cover and some of the other resources that I mentioned. So no worries there, you will have that available to you. As most of you have probably seen, the chat is open. Please ask questions. We will have time for Q&A. Julian and I will be answering questions as we go. You can use the Zoom Q&A feature for that as well. And again, make sure to change your chat to send messages to everyone. Okay, so with that, today we're talking about managing connections in Airflow. I'm going to be going through some of the content, and then we also have Julian Lenev, who you've seen in the chat, who's our CTO at Astronomer. We're very lucky to have him here and excited he's going to go through some of the demo as well. This is obviously a very frequently requested topic. Airflow connections are a big deal. They're something that almost everybody using Airflow has to deal with. If you have never had to use an Airflow connection and you use Airflow, I would actually love to hear from you and see how you have managed that, because I am convinced that it's not possible. But so we're here to help with some basics I'm going to go through an introduction to Airflow connections, how to create them, how to troubleshoot them if they're not working, a little more specific stuff on how to use a secrets backend. And then we are going to actually cover as well our connection management feature on Astro, which is Astronomer's managed service. So most of this will be relevant no matter how you're running Airflow for anybody using the open source project. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we do this in our product. Okay, so diving into our introduction, if you are newer to Airflow and have not used connections before, generally connections are a set of configurations that are used to connect with some other tool in the data ecosystem. Obviously, Airflow is designed to be an orchestrator. Again, I'm convinced that probably everybody has to do this, connect to other tools with Airflow, and connections are how you do that. Generally, they're going to contain the authentication information that you need for Airflow to talk to that external tool. Connections in Airflow are referenced by a unique connection ID string, so that's how you're going to actually use them in your DAGs. Again, what that looks like in practice is you define a connection, you give it an ID, that's a string. It can be whatever you want in that string, just the name, and then you're going to reference that in your operators. So that's kind of the most basic form of how these work. You can also access information from connections in your tasks. So in the previous example, most operators are set up to have a connection parameter. So if you're using pre-built hooks and operators within Airflow, probably all you have to do is provide that connection string. Say, this is where I've defined the information that you need to connect. The operator is going to take care of it for you. In some cases, that may not be your situation. You might be writing, custom functions or custom operators yourself or custom hooks. And need to access that information more directly. In that case, you can do all of that through the base hook. In this example, we're showing how to do that using like a task decorator for our custom Python function. And you can access through that base hook get connection method any of the information that you've put into the connection. In this case, we are printing all of it. I do want to give my obligatory, be careful when doing this. Connections often contain sensitive information. You can see in the screenshot below, the password has been obfuscated, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. But again, just be cautious when you're working with sensitive information in Airflow, kind of where you're pulling that out and pushing it into. With that, my spiel about sensitive information. So by default, Airflow is going to hide the password field, both in the Airflow UI and in the Airflow logs. So if you do something like we did in the previous task where you say print the password from this connection, that's going to be represented in asterisks so that you don't have your password in plain text anywhere. You can also hide other fields that you provide to the extras field in the connection. I'll talk more about that a little later. You can do that by setting this Airflow variable sensitive varchon fields to true. Make sure that that is set in your Airflow environment. And then within that, you can change what names in the extra field are always obfuscated with this other variable sensitive varchon name. So if you always have something in your extra fields that's called like, I don't know, pandas, that's a bad example since that's a package. But if that's you and like that's how you put in your sensitive information, you say, I never want this printed out in the logs, you can add it to that variable so that things are protected there. Okay, so that's kind of connection basics. Let's talk about methods for creating connections. Generally, you have 4 ways of doing this within Airflow itself. So again, without any connection, without any external systems or anything like that, just within Airflow, you can do this in 4 ways. You can create connections in the Airflow UI. This is probably the most common. If you're just getting started, this is probably what you're going to do. I'm going to show this a little later. Probably the next common, in my opinion, is doing this with environment variables. So those get added with the form Airflow _con _ whatever you want your connection ID to be. They have to be in that format for Airflow to know that they are a connection. So if you gave it a different name without that Airflow con and you're wondering why your task can't access it, that is probably why. Those can be defined either in a URI or in JSON, and I'm going to show an example of both of how you might do that. And note that any connections that are defined with environment variables will not show up in the UI. This trips people up quite a lot because you might add them to your environment and then you're looking at your connections in the UI and you don't see them. Doesn't mean they're not there. They're just not going to show up in the UI. Next is you can use the Airflow CLI and the Airflow REST API. So these are ways of programmatically adding connections. Both of these methods, your connections will show up in the Airflow UI after you've added them. I am going to show an example of this later. Both of these ways are pretty straightforward. They're also if you have to programmatically add or manage bulk connections. There's not like a super simple bulk upload of connections in Airflow, but generally if you're trying to do more than a single connection at once, these are going to be ways that you can do that. The next way of managing connections in Airflow is using a secrets backend. So now we're moving into things that are external to Airflow, but where you can store secrets. So generally, a secrets backend just means you are storing secrets somewhere external to Airflow, generally in a tool that is already designed for storing secrets, and Airflow is pulling them in. This is something that you have to configure for your Airflow environment. You can do that. There's a couple of different config things that you have to set. The backend that tells Airflow what it's going to use, and then the backend quargs, which tells Airflow what secrets it can pull from that backend. So you have to give them a prefix so that Airflow knows, again, when I say this con ID in my task, it says, where do I look for that in your backend? So that's how it recognizes those connections. I'm not going to show how to set up a secrets backend today because it generally varies a little bit depending on your Airflow setup and which backend you're using. But we do have some docs for this that are relevant, as does open source Airflow. So this is generally pretty straightforward. The available backends that Airflow supports today are, there's a couple of AWS services that are designed for secrets management, Google Cloud Secrets Manager, Azure Key Vault, and HashiCorp Vault. So again, pretty common tools used for managing secrets. Generally, we would recommend doing something like this if you are already using one of these tools for secrets management within your company and you need Airflow to pull those in. So we see this pretty frequently with companies who are using Airflow kind of in production at higher scale. This can be a more I would say standardized and reliable way than like managing connections manually in Airflow. So if you're smaller scale and you only have a couple of them, all of the Airflow methods are fine. If you're dealing with lots of them, this might be a better option for you. With those different methods of managing connections, it's important to note the order of precedence. So you do not necessarily need to define connections using only one of those methods. You can use multiple. And oftentimes people will. With that, Airflow is going to look for connections in the following order. So this means that if you have a connection that is defined in a couple of different places with the same name, this is the order Airflow is going to use. Especially important if you are mixing methods and updating connections using one of those methods. You're finding that your update is not being used. This is something to keep in mind. So that order is a secrets backend, again, if you have one set up. Second would be the Astro environment manager. So again, that's an if you are an Astronomer customer running Astro, that is going to be second. If neither of those apply to you, then you would go to environment variables. And then finally, Airflow's metadata database. So that is the other three methods that I mentioned. So if your connection shows up in the Airflow UI, it's in the metadata database. So that's anything defined in the UI with the CLI or with the REST API. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about how to find connection details for your provider or for your hook or whatever you are using. Generally, this is a frequent topic of confusion because Airflow has a lot of different hooks. There are a lot of different services you can connect to. And sometimes it is not trivial to figure out, like, what am I supposed to put into this connection? This is a great example of looking at the form in the UI. I've chosen the connection type HTTP, and it's asking me for a host and a port, which are not generally things I would associate with an API. Well, the host actually I would associate with an API, but maybe not a schema or a port. So how do you figure out like what actually to put in these connections? And I'm going to state that I'm going to talk about this pretty high level today. We cannot cover how to create every single type of connection that you might need to do in Airflow. We would be here all day, probably for multiple days. And a lot of them are just not going to be relevant to you because they're not services you use. So we're going to try and provide some guidance on just generally the steps that you might go through here. So I know I need to add a connection to a service, say BigQuery or Redshift or Snowflake. What should I do? The first thing that you need to do in every case is make sure that you have the relevant Airflow provider package installed. If you don't have the provider package installed, one, you can't use the hooks or operators associated with that provider. So you're not going to get very far. You also won't see the connection type in the UI. So that can be confusing. So make sure that that is in there. Next up is read the documentation of your provider. Hopefully that will give you specific details about what needs to go in the connection. Now, again, there are a lot of providers in Airflow. The documentation on them varies. A lot of them are contributed by the open source community. So they may or may not have exactly what you need, which is why we have future steps that you can go through past that. Next is check Astronomer Learn. In our integrations section, we have docs for some of the more commonly used connections, specifically on how to set up the connection, how to find the information. Again, we don't have that for every connection. I would love it if we did and we had the bandwidth for that, but we do have some of the more frequent ones, so that can potentially be helpful. Next is read the documentation of the tool that you are connecting to. Lots of times for tools, they will have documentation on what you need to provide for authentication. And that might clue you into, okay, what sort of stuff do I need to collect to put into this connection? Finally, if you have done all of that and you still are not sure exactly what you need to put in your connection, again, this is kind of the fallback plan. But if you are using like a new provider that doesn't have as much documentation or it's just not there, you can look at the source code of the hook that is being used. Particularly what will probably be most relevant is a method called getUIFieldBehavior, which is going to tell you things about the connection fields that were renamed in the UI. So again, for that connection form, sometimes the form will update for the connection that you're looking to use. And the content and format of any placeholder values. Obviously, looking through source code is not great user experience. We hope that you do not have to do this. I will say that when I first started using Airflow many years ago, I had to do this a lot more than I do now. So things are much better. But that is sort of your fallback plan. Again, if you can't figure anything out, that is a way to just go in and see like, what is the hook actually using? One example of that, so this is the AWS generic hook. Just pulled some of this code again that for that method getUIFieldBehavior. You can see in here the placeholders that are being used. One other thing that I think is particularly useful is for the extras. So extras in a connection are generally just like a catch-all field for, we don't have a specific place in the form for this. So it gets added as an extra. One of the hardest things in my opinion is figuring out like, okay, I need to put region in the extra, but what is it called? Like, what should I call this parameter? You will find stuff like that here. Like for this particular hook, it is region_name. Again, because all of these tools work differently, the hooks all work differently. So this is not always standardized across every provider that you might use within Airflow. So this is one way of figuring this out. Lots of times this sort of stuff will actually be in the documentation for the provider. So hopefully you don't have to actually look within the method itself, but you can if you need to. Okay, so let's talk about debugging a little bit. Again, we're going to provide some high-level guidance here because we cannot address every particular connection type issue that you might face, but connection issues are common in Airflow. So these are generally the steps that we would recommend going through if your connection does not work. The first step in any debugging ever, double check for typos. This just trips people up all of the time. I have done this a million times myself. Why is the connection not working? Then figured out like, oh, I actually called the connection something different in the connection field than I called it in my DAG. Next step would be to try and decouple testing your connection from Airflow. So try and figure out like, is it an Airflow issue or is it an issue with my tool? One easy way to do this is to make a direct API call, like if your tool has a CLI or using a Python script to that external tool, just to verify that your credentials do work. So again, if it works in an external Python script, but not within Airflow, then something's going on with how you've defined the connection in the context of Airflow for how the hook is using it. Obviously, if it doesn't work, then your credentials are wrong and you just need to figure that out. Again, double check the order of precedence. I have done this myself on multiple occasions where I have kind of mistakenly defined a connection in a couple of different ways and then updated it, but using a method that was lower on the order of precedence, and then tried to figure out like why the update wasn't working. So follow that order that we provided, especially if you're managing connections in different ways. Never hurts to check for typos again. Those are like 90% of code issues, period, I think. Finally, Airflow has some tools within it for testing connections that can be helpful for you, just to make the testing process easier. One is the test button in the Airflow UI. So I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Next, the REST API has a test endpoint where you can test a connection programmatically. The CLI also has something like this, so you can test a connection there. You can also use dag.test to test connection. So that actually doesn't even require running Airflow. So that can be a great option. And then finally, if you have done all of this and you're getting some weird obscure error and you just have no idea why, and it seems like it's a problem with the hook, try asking in the Airflow Slack. Again, that's a great resource. Chances are somebody else has encountered whatever weirdness you are encountering with your connection. So that can be a great place to get help. Okay, for the test connection button, things I want to touch on here. So as of recently, I believe this was changed in Airflow 2.7. The test connection button in Airflow is disabled by default. That's for security purposes, so that people can't be making connections to external tools unless your Airflow admin says that's okay. So if you want to use that, make sure that you enable it. You do that with this parameter in your Airflow config. Also note that this is not available for all connection types. Some of them, it will not work or the button will not show up. I think the HTTP one is a good example of if you try and test the connection, usually you get something weird coming back. So don't necessarily trust that if you get an error with the test connection. It doesn't necessarily mean your connection is bad. But if you get a success with that, I think it does mean your connection is good. Okay, and then, so everything I just talked about is relevant regardless of how you are running Airflow. But we do, if you are an Astronomer customer and you're running on Astro, our managed Airflow service, we do have a environment manager that makes managing connections really simple across deployments, and you can even work with this locally. We're going to show this in the demo in just a minute. So this will allow you to do things like link connections to all deployments or specific deployments, override connection fields, and again, use all of them locally. So just want to introduce that topic before we dive into the demo here. Okay, so that was a lot of information to go through. Connections, again, are a complex topic, but I want to go ahead and show how some of this works in the more basic sense. So I have Airflow, sorry, one sec, if I can get my Zoom thing to move. Airflow running locally here in computer. I've got a couple of different connections set up within this environment. So let's hop over to my code and look at this in the terminal. So I have one DAG in this environment that is designed to take data from an API and save it to Snowflake. For that, I need a couple of different connections. I need a connection to the API that I'm grabbing data from. So in this case, I'm using the HTTP operator, and you can see I provide an HTTP con ID, and that's called API con is what I've called it. So that's a connection to the API where I'm grabbing data. I then have a Python operator that's doing some hypothetical processing for this data that's not using a connection. And then finally, I have a Snowflake operator that is going to load that data hypothetically into Snowflake. This is using a Snowflake con ID. And here I've put Snowflake dev con. Again, note that in your operator, what this parameter is called will vary. Check your operator documentation. But in all cases, you will need to provide that connection string, and Airflow is going to look for a connection of this name. So I've got connections in this environment defined in a couple of different ways. I have a couple of defined locally, or I should say grammatically, as environment variables. So I'm working in the context of the Astro CLI here, which is open source, so you can use this regardless of whether you're a customer or not. In this case, the easiest way to add Airflow environment variables is using this .m file. So you just add them in here. Your mileage may vary with how you do this in your Airflow setup. But again, adding them as environment variables, the biggest thing to note is that you need to have them of this form, Airflow _con _ whatever the connection is named. So here I have a Snowflake dev con and a Snowflake prod con that I've done in two different ways. So you can define these as a URI like I do here. Again, what you put in this URI depends on what your connection needs. So generally it's going to be something of the form, the connection type, which is Snowflake, And then all of my login information. So you'll notice, obviously, in this case, I have not actually put all of my login information in there. But this is my login. I would put a password here. I have to put in an account. This is also not our account. And then a region. Alternatively, if you prefer, you can define them in JSON, which I tend to think is a little bit more readable. But again, matter of personal preference. So in this particular case, you're going to put in everything that you need for that Snowflake connection. Another thing to note here is that, so in order to use this connection type and the operator, the Snowflake operator, I need to have the Snowflake provider installed. So in my case, I've added that in my requirements.txt file. Again, you'll have to make sure that you add that to your Airflow environment. The other option that you have available to you is adding them in the UI. So to do that, admin, connections, and then we'll see I've already added an API icon here, but generally you're going to go add a new record and then search for your connection type. Again, this is where your connection type will not show up unless you have the provider. If I search for Snowflake, another way I could have added those Snowflake connections is filling them out here. You'll notice that for this connection, all of the fields updated. So this looks different than the default, which is kind of your standard like database connections. This has been updated for the things that you need specifically for Snowflake. So account, warehouse, database, region, role. Some of these are optional. Some of them you can also put in your operator. You can play around with kind of how that works, but that is one option there. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel it for my API connection. This is the one used by my HTTP operator. So I have chosen the HTTP connection type here. This is an example of one that did not update the form. So HTTP is pretty basic, but this is one that can potentially be confusing for folks because, again, obviously something like a port is probably not going to apply to an API endpoint. Some of them are just not designed to update. That's additional code that somebody has contributed to override those fields. And that's not there for every connection. So again, that's where the documentation is going to help you out if yours does not update to figure out, okay, where do I actually put something in? In this particular case, I've provided a host, which is my API endpoint. I'm actually using one that does not require authentication, but if I were to need like a bearer token or something like that, I would put that here in the extras. Again, noting that my test button is grayed out here because I don't have it enabled in this environment. This is contact your deployment admin to enable it. You have to change that parameter or contact your deployment admin if you're not the person who does that. Okay, so now that I have all of those set up, well, actually, I want to cover one other way of, again, setting them up, or two other ways is using the Airflow CLI or the Airflow REST API. I'm just going to show the CLI. So this is pretty straightforward to do this in your environment. So I'm going to add another HTTP connection option here. Generally, we'll provide the links to the Airflow CLI reference. Again, I'm doing this through the Astro CLI, so that means I add this Astro dev run and then the command. If you were just working not within the Astro CLI, your command would be Airflow connections add. And then you add your connection name, any parameters. So I'm adding a host for a new connection, and then you need that connection type. If I run this, it's going to spit out some stuff and then say it was successfully added. Now, if I go back to my environment and go back to Airflow connections, I can see that show up here. So again, this is going to happen for if you add things via the CLI or the REST API. It will not for any environment variables. So you'll notice my Snowflake connections do not show up here. Does not mean they don't exist. They are in my environment, but they're just not going to show up. So now if I go back to DAGs here, let's take a look at this one. I have run this a couple times. You'll notice it failed on the save to Snowflake task. That totally makes sense because I just provided password as my password, which is not actually the password for my Snowflake account. This is going to show up in my logs and it's going to give me an error here that it failed to connect to the database. You can tell that it's using my connection. So my connection is actually there, because otherwise it would give me an error that said the connection was not found. But it's going to tell me that those credentials are not accurate. So again, one way of checking if you're defining via environment variables or something like that is to just add them and see what happens in your task. Realistically, you might want to use one of those other testing options first if you don't want to deal with like testing the task itself along with testing the connection. Okay. And then finally, I want to show a couple things for like if I want to add, sorry, my Zoom like bar is totally in the way of all of my tabs here. Say you want to add a connection that is it's not totally clear what you need to put in it. So I'm going to choose BigQuery for this example. Oops. So I go to Google BigQuery and you can see nothing's been updated for this one. It's just like the general connection information, which is more specific to just a generic database. So kind of unclear what I need to put in here. And be my first step here is to, again, look at the documentation. So I'm going to do that through the Astronomer registry. And I'm going to search for, you can see I searched for this yesterday, the BigQuery hook. And just look at what the documentation is in here. You can see I need to provide a GCP con ID. But then if I look down at the actual documentation for the hook, it says this hook uses Google Cloud connection, which tells me that it's not actually using the BigQuery connection type. It's designed to use the other one. So if I struggle with tabs again, go back to this and instead choose just the Google Cloud connection, you can see this one actually does update with all of the information that I need. So one example of where looking at the documentation might help you out, figure out what you need to put in them. Okay. So now that this is again pretty basic, just overview of how to manage connections with open source Airflow. One of the things that you will have noticed when we looked at my environment here is for the Snowflake connection, for example, I defined both a dev connection and a prod connection, which is pretty typical because you might have different information that you want Airflow to use to connect, whether you're running in dev or in prod. Managing this in the way I've done, where I have put the specific dev con like hard coded into my DAG here, is not great for managing a lot of DAGs, including the progression from dev to prod. So one of the things, again, we want to show is how Astro, Astronomer's managed service, handles things like this and how it makes connection management easier. So everything I've shown so far, again, is relevant regardless of how you are using Airflow for any open source users. I want to talk a little bit about if you are an Astronomer customer and are using Astro, how that's going to work. So for that, Julian is going to take us through that demo.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenton. Like Kenton mentioned, my name is Julian. I am Astronomer's CTO. I'm super excited to be here today. I love doing these webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about some functionality that we've actually pretty recently built out to make the whole connection management process easier. As I'm sure was very obvious from Kenton's portion of the demo, managing connections in Airflow can be difficult. There's no other way to say it. There's lots of different methods of managing those connections. There's lots of different ways to define them. And it can get messy pretty quick. At Astronomer, we're trying to make managing Airflow easier. And obviously, as part of that, we need to make managing connections easier. If you have not yet tried the platform, we now actually have a free trial. So if you go to astronomer.io and click on this Get Started Free button in the top right, you can either follow along or take notes and come back to it afterwards and experience this for yourself. The Astronomer UI is organized into different workspaces. So here I'm in my personal organization called Julian, and I'm in my connection management webinar workspace. Within this, I have one deployment that I've created but we'll spend the majority of today's time looking at this environment tab. This environment tab is essentially a managed secrets backend that we offer at Astronomer. It makes the process of creating connections, managing connections, updating them, sharing them a lot easier. To start, I wanted to show what it looks like to first create a connection. To do that, I go to this environments tab. I'm making sure that I have connection selected here, and I can click this plus connection button in the top right. This is going to list all of the different connection types that Astro currently supports with this connection management feature. We're adding new connection types every day. So if you see something on this, or if you don't see something on this list that you would expect to see, or that is helpful for your use case, just reach out to us because it's super easy to add new ones. But one of the very simple things that we've done, and I think has been very effective, is we've actually rebuilt each of these connection forms to make it much, much easier to understand what fields you need to fill out, where you get those values from, what examples look like. So let's look at Snowflake, for example. When I click create connection, I can search in the top bar for all the different options. Here I'm searching for Snowflake. I can see there's actually two different forms for Snowflake. One where I'm authenticating with a username and password, and one where I'm authenticating with a private key. With normal open source Airflow, there's actually only one form for Snowflake, regardless of how you're authenticating. And that makes it really difficult to give good experiences for creating the connection because the form has to be generic enough to account for all different methods of authenticating. In this case, let's look at username and password. And this is what I mean by the form experience that we've built out. So I'll get back to this link to all deployments in a section. I'll get back to this link to all deployments section in a second. But everything below that is meant for creating your connection. So I can give it a connection ID, I give it a username, account, and password. And those are actually the only things that are required when you're building out a Snowflake connection and authenticating with username and password. There's a lot more optional configuration that you can specify. So I can click on this more options field and go see all of the different things that Snowflake supports. If I look at the Snowflake connection type with private key, you'll see it's actually different. So I, again, have my connection ID. I'm still going to have a username and account. But instead of a password, I have my private key passphrase and my private key path and all of the additional configuration. So this makes it a lot easier to create connections where you know exactly what you need to fill out. You can see example values, and the forms are very purpose-built. The next thing I want to show, after having created the connection, I went ahead and created one before this just so that I don't have to deal with copy pasting credentials. I've called it my Snowflake connection. I can see its connection type Snowflake, and you'll notice this deployment section where it says all deployments. So when I'm creating connections in Astronomer, I'm doing so within the context of a workspace. A workspace can have, one-to-many deployments. In this case, I only have one called demo dev, but I can create a demo prod deployment. Now I have two deployments in this workspace. And so this environment management feature is very useful for managing connections across multiple deployments. I can see here that this deployment sharing is linked to all. So this link to all deployments is toggled to true. And I can read when it's set to yes, all deployments in this workspace will have access to this connection. So if you're managing many deployments or you're trying to share connections across dev and prod versions of your deployment, Astro lets you define that connection once with a nice form and share it everywhere instead of having to redefine it for every deployment. So when I click into this connection, again, I can see it's shared to everything, and I can see that it's, that means that both my dev and prod deployments have access to it. The other really neat thing that you can do is, let's say in my connection here, I've set it to point at my dev database. I want my database to change between my dev and prod deployment, but I'm going to use the same credentials, or I'm going to share an account or username. What we've also built in the ability to do is override specific fields within a connection. So I can actually edit this link to the deployments. And I can see here, this connection is being shared with my prod deployment. It's using, my accounts, or my username, my account. The password's not going to be shown. I can actually override the database fields, and call it, demo prod. I'll get a little message here saying this value overrides the parent value. And what that means is my base connection here, the My Snowflake connection, does not have a database defined. But if I update this connection, oops, I'll have to look into that afterwards. But I can override specific fields so that when this connection gets shared to my production deployment, it's running off of the right database or right schema or right username and password. So this makes the experience of managing, many connections, many deployments a lot easier. The other really nice thing that we've built in is the ability for these connections to work locally. So if I go to my terminal here, right before this, I ran the Astro dev start command in a local Astro CLI project that I have. So this has spun up a local Airflow instance for me. I can go refresh that, log in, and I will see that I have no connections defined. I have this Snowflake DAG that has two Snowflake operators. It runs on the connection called my Snowflake con, and that's the one that I've defined in my workspace. It'd be really nice if I could just, clone that connection locally, and that's exactly what we've built the ability to do. So if I go back to my CLI and run Astro dev stop, give that a second, I can run Astro dev starts and actually give it my workspace ID from Astro. I can find that workspace ID either in the URL or by going to workspace settings, and finding it right here. So it starts with CLR, just to confirm. Yep, CLR. And now when I run Astro login first, make sure that I am authenticated. Go through a couple rounds of two-factor authentication. Okay, now I should be able to run Astro workspace switch, make sure that I'm in, yep, connection management webinar. Now if I run Astro dev start with the workspace ID, it'll start my local Airflow instance as normal, but you'll see here in a second that I'll get a message saying that the Astro CLI is automatically populating my local Airflow instance with my connection. So here, added connection, my Snowflake con. If I now go back and go to, sorry, the Zoom thing is annoying. Go to admin connections, I see my Snowflake con here. I didn't have to recreate this connection manually. All I did was give the Astro CLI my workspace ID after running Astro login. And if I run this DAG again, now that I have that connection populated, I should see successes. So in this case, I'm just running some, simple select current version, select one as hello world. And those queries do run successfully. So the connection's been populated. And this means that setting up new developers, new repositories, new Airflow deployments on Astro is super, super easy and super quick, because this workspace environment acts as a central source of truth and governance to go define your connections in one place and share them everywhere. We also have, audit logs, those types of things set up so you can see who exactly is accessing those connections. But we think this is a really powerful feature, and it should help avoid, you having to go through the trouble of setting up a secrets backend yourself. Like I mentioned, this you can access this yourself. You can click on this Get Started Free button on astronomer.io and give it a chance. If you have any questions, definitely let us know. That's why we're here. But with that, there are a couple additional resources here that I'll send out in the chat in a second. But with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Julian, for going through that demo. We do have a couple of other questions that we have not addressed in the chat and in the Q&A that I think we'll touch on live here. I also want to mention that all of the resources that we covered and that are listed in the slides, we will also send out in the recap. So if you didn't manage to copy them from the chat, no worries, you will have them there. One question, and I think this is for you. One thing that the Airflow UI lacks is a way to show all DAGs that use a certain connection. This is a great question. Does the Astro UI, the Astro environment manager, have that feature, or is there a plan for it to have that feature?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, personally, I would love that feature too. The connection management feature that I just demoed, and that we've built at Astronomer is relatively new. We've released it in the last couple of months, so I think there's still a huge opportunity to make it even better. And that's definitely a great idea. I'll make a note of it and make sure that we look into it and get to it.
Yeah, that's one I've heard before, both from Astronomer customers and in the open source community. So I think some kind of auditing like that would definitely be helpful. Let's see. What can we do to make sure people don't pull down connections and print out passwords or keys when using the Astro CLI? Great question. So I'll touch on that briefly for the local option, and then I'll have you cover the Astro option. So with the Astro CLI, if you are just using it to run Airflow locally as I demoed, and you've defined connections in there, you do want to be careful with a few things. So that I answered another question about this just a minute ago. With the Airflow CLI, there are commands that you could also run using the Astro CLI that will pull down sensitive information from your credentials. So connections list, connections get, those commands are designed so that you can actually get the full information from that connection and then potentially send it elsewhere. So if you were going to say, download all of your connections from your environment, and then take them to a different Airflow environment, you would actually want like a file with all of that information in it, including the password. So that's what those commands are designed to do. So they will print stuff out in plain text where you would not see it in like an Airflow log. If you are just working locally with the Astro CLI, we would recommend that you not manage connections that way. Probably that's not going to be your production Airflow instance in general. So I would say exercise caution with anything that you have just defined locally. In terms of what is a better way of securely managing connections, both with local use and for the connections that you've defined on Astro. Julian, do you want to cover again, I should say, like how the feature works for that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Kenton, what you said is pretty spot on. Ultimately, when you do give users access to pull these connections and use these connections, you are putting them in a trusted position. Generally, the way we recommend handling that is first by like looking at your authorization model. So one thing I forgot to mention was with Astro, each of these connections, like you have to have certain permissions within the product to be able to use them locally. And that means that you can decide, who and who does not have access to those things. There may be some connections that, might be better managed locally outside of Astro if people are coming with individual non-privileged credentials. The other thing that we have is audit logs so that you can understand who is accessing each of the connections. in case, you don't have authorization set up properly and need to go do an audit.
Yeah, awesome. And as I see the follow-up to that question, asking about in cases where you might have, folks with DAGs that access like a database that they do not have access to. So your DAG authors should not have access to the service that those DAGs are connecting to. I think in cases like that, as Julian said, Astro obviously has some of that built in. If you are not running on Astro, if you're using open source Airflow in some other way on-prem or that you have set up, Airflow also does have some RBAC built-in. I would say defer to those rules to manage things like that. And in those cases, I would say absolutely do not define connections as I did in my demo in your M file to be used locally, if those are services that you do not want your DAG authors using. So that is part of what we demoed, is just not the way that you would do that. Yeah, and then a question on editing connections. So yes, you can also do this with the option that I showed in the Airflow CLI. If you add one for an existing connection, if the connection ID already exists, it should just update the fields. It will overwrite them with whatever you put in. So you can use that add as an update there as well. Okay. We are about at time, and I think we have answered all the questions. So I just want to throw one additional thing out there for folks. If I can find my share and pull up the slides here. So as a offer for everybody who joined us today, so one thing I did just put the link to our free trial in the chat. So if you are interested in trying out any of the stuff that Julian talked about, you can do that for free. We also have an offer for anybody who joined us today for a free Airflow certification. This is run through our Astronomer Academy. There is a module in our Academy that covers Airflow connections, a lot of the same kind of basic stuff that I talked about, and then will be covered in the certification. So if you want to learn more about that, as well as other kind of introductory Airflow topics, or if you're already an Airflow expert and you just want to take the exam and get certified to have that on your resume, that is a great option there. And we have a free code for you to use. And I will, if you give me just a moment, throw that in the chat so that you have that available to you. All right. And otherwise, I think that is all we have for folks. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And here we go. Sorry, I need my fundamental there. That's the code. So you don't have to copy this from the slide. Yeah, thanks folks for joining us today. Lots to go through, and we hope to see you next time. Okay, bye all.